Welcome to today's Explainer. Today, we're going to unpack what just might be the most demanding executive job description in human history, the exact qualifications required to lead the Islamic State, or the Caliphate. And hey, you might notice that our visuals today won't feature any drawings of people. That's not just to keep us laser-focused on the actual structures and data, but it's also a pretty fitting nod to the classical Islamic tradition itself. So we're going to look strictly at the historical source material to figure out exactly what it took to get the top job, keep it, and, in some really wild historical cases, lose it.
Here is our agenda for today. We'll be looking at 1. The ultimate job description, 2. Building a ruling personality, 3. Competence over piety, 4. Physical impediments to ruling, 5. Islamic checks and balances, and finally, 6. Managing royal shortcomings. Let's get right into it.
Section 1. The ultimate job description, defining the core prerequisite. Okay, to really understand how the caliphate functioned, we have to start at the absolute baseline requirement for even being considered for the job. It's a concept called Al-Kifāyah. Now, what's fascinating here is that Al-Kifāyah is definitely not just about general intelligence or, being book smart. It requires a highly specific ruling personality. We're talking sharp statesmanship, elite problem solving, and this immense capacity for perseverance, which is known as Sabr. And Sabr is absolutely crucial here. Because think about it. A ruler without it might act recklessly, or they could be easily provoked into actions that completely tank the state. You had to be a true statesman who wouldn't just crumble under the immense weight of the office. Section 2. Building a ruling personality, the historical training grounds. A ruling personality isn't exactly something you're just born with, right? It has to be rigorously developed. The early sources tell this incredible story about one of Prophet Muhammad's earliest and most devout followers, a man named Abu Zar. When Abu Zar asked for an official post, the Prophet actually turned him down. He explicitly told him that despite his incredibly high religious rank, he had a weak ruling personality. But, and this is the key takeaway, that wasn't the end of his story. Through intense development and shadowing, Abu Zar eventually built up those necessary skills and was later trusted to serve as a deputy in Medina. So it was all about the training. Later empires took this concept and totally institutionalized it. The Umayyads and Abbasids basically used the empire as a giant training ground, giving heirs jobs as provincial governors or military commanders just to build their resumes. But wow, the early Ottomans took a much darker approach. They literally employed a survival of the fittest battle among the Sultan's sons to guarantee only the most capable and, let's be real, ruthless took the throne. Eventually, though, to stop those bloody civil wars, the Ottomans evolved this into the kafes, or the cage system. They started keeping heirs under luxurious house arrest in the palace harem. The tragic irony here? By locking them away to prevent civil war, they completely destroyed their ability to gain any real-world competency. Section 3. Competence over piety, the pragmatic choice. This brings us to a surprisingly practical rule in classical Islamic governance, prioritizing actual executive capability over sheer personal piety. For instance, the Prophet retained leaders like Badan, who was the governor of Yemen. Now, Badan was a brand new convert to Islam, but he possessed elite administrative skills and he knew his people inside and out. The sources show a very clear pattern. Retaining an experienced, highly competent administrator was almost always prioritized over appointing an incredibly pious early companion who just didn't have that executive experience. You simply needed the skills to govern, period. Historically speaking, this intense pragmatism really defined the classical Sunni position. They chose a capable yet entirely fallible human leader to prevent chaos and administer the law. The classical Shiite position, on the other hand, relied on an infallible, divinely appointed leader. But here is where it gets super interesting in the modern era. Modern Shiite political thought, primarily through Ayatollah Khomeini's governance of the jurist, has evolved to utilize fallible scholars to govern the state in the absence of the infallible imam. So we're actually seeing this fascinating convergence on the absolute need for capable human administration today. Section 4. Physical impediments to ruling, the medical checklist. Because Al-Kifāyah is a literal, contractual condition of leadership, historical jurists had to meticulously lay out exactly what physical ailments disqualified a leader. And this shows a really granular, almost clinical pragmatism from medieval jurists like Al-Mawardi. For example, minor issues, say occasional fainting spells or losing a single hand, might not disqualify a sitting caliph who was otherwise doing a stellar job. However, permanent loss of intellect or total blindness, that would immediately void their capability to rule. It wasn't about aesthetics at all. It was strictly about whether their physical reality prevented them from doing the heavy lifting of the state. So, naturally, this begs a massive question. If a caliph begins to fail in their competency, or their health totally declines, who actually has the legal authority to hire or fire them?
Section 5. Islamic checks and balances. Enforcing the rules.
First up, we have the Ahlul Hali wal Aqd, which translates beautifully to the people who loosen and bind. You can basically think of them as an electoral college or a parliament. They represent the masses. They evaluate the candidates to guarantee they possess that crucial Al-Kifāyah. And then they formally contract the bay'ah, the pledge of allegiance, to the new ruler. The ruler literally only has power through this specific contract. But once they're in power, the caliph definitely does not have a blank check. They are heavily monitored by the Mazalim Court, or the Court of Injustices. This acts essentially as an independent Supreme Court. If the caliph loses their competency or somehow violates the contract, this court has the ultimate judicial authority to investigate, issue warnings, and yes, even legally strip the caliph of their power entirely. And we actually see this exact system play out in real life with the Ottoman Sultan Mustafa I. Remember that kafes, or cage system we talked about earlier? Well, Mustafa's prolonged confinement left him severely mentally unfit for the job. He famously started throwing state gold coins into the sea to feed the fish, and he'd casually knock the turbans off his ministers' heads during incredibly serious meetings. The state apparatus quickly recognized he lacked Al-Kifāyah, so in 1618 he was legally deposed by the council and replaced. The system recognized the failure, and it removed the executive.
Section 6. Managing Royal Shortcomings. The Power of Delegation.
Now, obviously, no ruler is perfect, because every ruler is just human. The system was designed with built-in mechanisms to manage everyday shortcomings without needing a full-blown, dramatic deposition. Even Abu Bakr, the very first caliph of Islam and the closest companion of the Prophet, explicitly recognized human fallibility. In his inaugural address, he set a precedent of profound humility. He publicly acknowledged that a leader cannot govern alone, and he literally asked the people to correct him if he strayed. So, to compensate for those human blind spots, caliphs heavily utilized a wazir, acting very much like a highly empowered modern vice president or prime minister. They also established specialized advisory councils to make sure the leader had constant expert consultation. But the law drew a very hard line here. The caliph was legally prevented from completely abandoning their own executive duties. They could delegate tasks, sure, but they couldn't just hand over the keys to the empire and go on a perpetual vacation. They had to remain engaged and responsible for the state.
Which leaves us with a pretty fascinating final thought to ponder today. When you critically examine the historical caliphate as detailed in these sources, with its strict competency tests, its insistence on real-world training over sheer pedigree, and the authority of independent Supreme Courts to literally depose an unfit executive, how do today's global political structures really measure up? Are our modern systems demanding the same level of ultimate competence and constant accountability? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and remember, keep questioning the structures around you.